Hi and welcome to this week's Archives of Warcraft, the series where we look at features in dungeons today that are left over from vanilla times, look at the quests that they were involved with, or just what those features were for. If you haven't seen Lower Blackrock Spire, click on the notification to the top left. If you want to see the playlist with all of the ones in the series so far, click on the top right. So the first aspect of Upper Blackrock Spire is actually outside the instance. It's this NPC here called the Quartermaster. He wasn't located exactly here, but it was roughly this area. He started you off on a quest. He would drop an envelope with a command, a communique, which would start you off on a quest to go through Upper Blackrock Spire, defeat the final boss, touch something called the Orb of Command, which we'll go over later. This used to attune you to Blackwing Lair, which was located within Upper Blackrock Spire, and it allowed you to transport yourself into that raid instance without having to travel all the way through Upper Blackrock Spire. Now, as we noted last week, the instance entrance used to be here where I'm walking through now, but of course it's not, because Lower Blackrock Spire and Upper Blackrock Spire are split into two separate instances. Upper Blackrock Spire, once you got into the instance, was barred to you by a couple of doors, which are not there anymore, but you needed something called the Seal of Ascension to get into it, and just showing you here, I showed you the quest line that was involved in that in the Lower Blackrock Spire episode last week. What would happen is if you had this on your person, the doors would just open as you went up to it. So you always needed someone in the group who had that. So as we come up to the first boss, there's a load of orcs stood around the room, as there were at the time, except they were channeling the first boss, which is not the same first boss here. Something called Incendious, which is a fire elemental. They were holding it in place. And behind it, there was a pedestal. You all had to, or a few of you had to click on the pedestal to break the boss out of its banish, and then you kill that. Now, there is a reference to Incendious actually outside Blackrock Depths. If you go to Blackrock Depths, or just outside the instance, there is a fire elemental called Pyron, and when you kill him, he yells something that includes Incendious raising him back up again, and that is the NPC it is referring to. As you kill this first boss, these doors swing open just as they did before, except the room you went into was full of whelp eggs. Of course, this is the scene of the famous Leroy Jenkins skit.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this! Leroy Jenkins!
Oh my god, he just ran in.
You wouldn't just run in here at all because it's full of eggs. If you went near them, they would open out and into whelps, and you could very quickly get a lot of them onto you, and they did a lot of damage. Each individual one was quite weak, but a fair amount of damage. There were also dragonkin that would come out down in waves. This was the source of a boss in this room, but it was an optional boss. It's called Father Flame, and what you'd want to do is to get someone, preferably a rogue, to sneak down to this end without setting off any whelps, and to basically take something, which was a green item of no particular interest to anyone, but it would start a process of waves of dragonkins coming in. Finally, a boss that could drop, amongst other things, the devout shoulders of Leroy Jenkins fame, which are actually the priest shoulders, but that's what he's wearing if you look at the follower in your garrison. There was a quest to sort of take one of these eggs as well, but you treat this area with great respect, and mostly you wouldn't do this boss. It was literally only if someone needed that piece of loot. You would follow around here as we do now, and in these rooms there were a couple of bosses actually. There was a potential rare called Jed Runewalker, as well as Anvil Crack, who was involved as a blacksmith. There was a blacksmithing quest in this particular area. This area didn't really have ogres. It had Blackrock orcs and dragonkins in the area, and they used to bounce you around. So what you would actually do is you will certainly, again, wouldn't go steaming mob-handed in, but this is a theme of lots of dungeons back in vanilla. You didn't go rushing into the mobs. You would pull back, and we'd pull them back around the corner and jam our backs up against the wall. When it came to the encounter here, it worked much the same. You had waves, but instead of wargs, it was chromatic whelps. Now, more on that in a moment, as well as orcs, of course. Up there, instead of the two bosses you have at the moment, you had Nefarian in human form, as well as Rend Blackhand, who is the son of the sort of the Blackhand who was the war chief during the initial wars between the orcs and the humans. The Black Hand that we fight in Blackrock Foundry and Draenor, of course, that's an alternate version. And again, you certainly didn't just go wading mob-handed into the gates here. You tend to, or some people tend to stand back a little bit. There were 15 of you when we did this. As I say, last week it was a raid instance to begin with. It was intended for 15 to begin with. Later on, vanilla, it was tuned so that 10 people could reasonably do it. And of course, you could 5-man it or even a bit less if you had raid gear. And it culminated like this, but with a drake called Glyph that Rend used to ride, and you'd kill the drake first and then Rend would fall off it. There were a couple of interesting items it could drop. It could drop the chromatic carapace. This was an epic drop that was used as part of a quest line to get a epic breastplate for plate and I think male users. Long quest chain. I still have the chromatic carapace. I never actually finished it. By the time I was getting close, I was already in raid gear and it wouldn't have been as good. Could also drop a couple of swords. One of them, the Dalren's Sacred Charge, which is now immortalised in the heirloom system. This is Orby. You save Orby later on, which I'll mention. But a dragon did come in here if you had the Seal of Ascension. But it was a red dragon who would sometimes come and help you at this point if you called for them. This is the location we used to find Orby, a whelp who was being tortured by Blackrock orcs, and you would save her. And that set you off on another little quest chain. And the reason a blue dragon is there at all in what is, after all, the lair of a black dragon, Nefarian, is because Nefarian is trying to experiment with dragons from all the different dragon flights to create something he calls the chromatic dragon flight, which would be dragons that have the properties, the skills and strengths of all of the different dragon flights. In the room to the left is now Son of the Beast, which is an optional boss. Now, of course, at the time, all bosses effectively were optional. Just did whichever ones you want. But, of course, most people would do the Beast. This was a core hound, and he wouldn't have the tank rush into it, actually, because the first person who ran towards it, he would punt across the room, and he would immediately drop aggro. So some poor, unfortunate gnome would be sent, dispatched off towards it, get punted across the room, then the tank would run in. I suppose it works much like Son of the Beast works. It was a fairly nasty boss, though, with a lot of conflags going on. But out of its belly, when you killed it, came a little goblin called Finkelhorn. And it could also drop, this boss, Finkel Skinner, which was a dagger, which gave you plus 10 skinning skill. And you needed this to skin core hounds, because you needed the maximum profession skill at the time was 300. You needed over 300 to be able to skin core hounds, and this gave you plus 10. Now you could skin the beast for something called the Hide of the Beast, which was again involved in a quest line for an epic, this time for casters. The room was also the source later on of summoning, which I've also gone through in a few dungeons before, from the Brazier of Invocation for a boss that was involved in the quest line to upgrade your blue dungeon gear to epic. Unfortunately, as the instance has been massively changed, a bit like Scholarmance, it's not possible to summon it there now, so I won't be able to show you that other than a little picture from the time. Now, at the time, this would be the final room. There were a number of mobs around the room as there are now. Again, you wouldn't wade in. There were a couple of patrols. They were very nasty. You would take your time. The final boss, General Drakisath, was flanked by two dragonkin, that were fairly nasty in their own. Drakisath used to do like a conflag on people, which would disorientate them. So the general tactic at the time was to get a hunter to kite him back to the beast room while you killed the other two ads by him. And what will hopefully happen by the time the hunter got to the beast room, you would have taken care of those. He could then feign death, and then the general would come back to you. You'd need two tanks to swap because, as I say, every now and then he'd put a conflag on his target. That would disorientate them, drop their threat, so then the other tank would take over. And it was a sort of rinse and repeat like that. Don't go too near it unless you were melee. You had no choice. And then behind him was the Orb of Command. So what you would do if you had the quest from the Quartermaster is you would touch this orb and that would attune you to Blackwing Lair, which meant that instead of having to go into the instance, because you can do that if you look past here, which is just a bit back before we got to the beast room. It's closed off at the moment. You can still see the entrance to Blackwing Lair, You could just go past there. This is where Nefarian and Rend were talking earlier on in the instance. And Nefarian's buggered off now into Blackwing Lair, of course. So you could get in that way. But of course, that's you don't want to do that every time you go into a raid instance. So there was another little orb outside the instance you could touch if you were attuned, would teleport you directly into it. General Drakisath was also involved in the Onyxia quest chain, at the very least for Alliance, but more about that later. So that's Upper Blackrock Spire. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Next one in the Blackrock Mountain series will be Blackrock Depths, and that'll be next week. Until then, I'll see you later.
Leroy, you were just stupid as hell.